Hi, I'm Sean Passera, the Mindful Farmer. In this video, I want to be breaking down what is an in-ground bed or a raised bed and why you might choose one or the other. There's a lot of information out there on YouTube about building raised beds or doing no-dig beds or in-ground beds or permanent beds or semi-permanent beds, all this examples, but there's not a lot of information out there about how to choose which one is right for you and when you might do one for one system and a different one for another. So like if you're doing herbs, you might use permanent beds. If you're doing annuals, you might use in-ground beds. So I hope this video is helpful for you to navigate that and making that choice. I'm going to actually be using my breakfast and the kids' breakfast to be showing you. So hopefully I can get the video made before the kids find the pancakes and the waffles and ruin my my visual example for you guys. So in making the decision on whether to use an in-ground bed or raised bed, there's 4 factors that we need to consider, and that's winter, so how cold it gets, the rainfall, the soil texture, and the slope. So winter, rainfall, soil, slope. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my breakfast and the kids' breakfast to break down this visualization and hopefully help it make sense of when you would make a choice for in-ground bed or raised beds. So the first one I want to jump into is the winter. So depending on what your winters are like, does the soil freeze solid? Is it workable in the spring? Do you have to wait till it's thawed out to plant seeds? A lot of that will influence whether you use in-ground bed or raised bed. And so for your vegetable garden. And so imagine these 2 pancakes are frozen solid. You know, when they start to thaw, they're going to thaw from the top down. Because they're insulated by the plate, which is the earth. And, to speed up that thawing process, what we can do is we pull that pancake apart. So it gets more surface area. It's going to thaw out and dry more quickly. So this would be an example of our raised beds. So if you're planting garlic and you're in a northern climate, like probably Arkansas or further north, doing raised beds in the fall for a planting of something that's going to overwinter might be a good choice, like your garlic. If it doesn't matter and your soils stay thawed out pretty much year round, like Texas, Louisiana, raised beds may not be the choice for your crops based on winter and cold weather alone. But there's other factors. And so they all kind of build into each other. And so we'll keep breaking those down. The other one is rainfall. And this is an example, like I mentioned, Texas or Louisiana, where it might be a good example, a good instance to use raised beds. So it's not because it's too cold in the wintertime, it's because it's too wet in the springtime or the wintertime. So we're going to let the syrup be our rainfall. And if you pour it on a pancake, it's going to run off. It's our example of runoff. Good soils, like sandy soil, would soak in. We'll talk more about that in a second. But for the raised beds, it gives you an opportunity to get all that water to run off in kind of a controlled way. So thinking about Texas and Louisiana getting hit by hurricanes, and it's flat as a pancake down there, pun intended, that water has nowhere to go. So your crops are just going to sit in that moisture. Being able to do raised beds if you're in a high moisture area is, 1, going to give you a way to control that water and get it away from your site. And 2, it's going to be able to allow the water that's in the bed itself, that hits the bed in rainfall, to go down and out. So that's how high rainfall would, or doing a raised bed in a high rainfall area would make sense. But if you're low rainfall or moderate rainfall, it might not make sense because, like I said, that water's going down and away. And so your bed is going to be more likely to dry out the higher it is. I call them volcano beds. And so one example of that is the common raised beds most people use in their home garden, where they frame them with lumber. Imagine here's our framed raised bed right here. And it's stacked super high. Got 2 foot of wood around it, and then we filled it with soil from Lowe's. whenever that rain hits that, it's just going right down the sides and then out. This top layer is going to dry out super, super easy. So if you need your moisture, and that might even be a high rainfall area like, coastal Texas or here in Arkansas, but you need that moisture in the summertime, you might consider doing in-ground beds for your summer crops, and maybe raised beds for something like your garlic in the winter, where you need to get excess water away and you need the beds to warm up quickly. So it all just kind of depends on what you're trying to achieve. Another example of the rainfall, and I think this is pretty cool, this is called a waffle garden. And this would be an example of something you might do in like Arizona, Utah, Nevada, where the ridges on the waffle actually represent the walk paths, and the depressions are where you would plant your vegetables. And so when it rains, or if it rains, it goes into those little holes and waters the plant, soaks into the ground. But because it's a low rainfall area, you're not worried about it flooding. You're not going to make a rice paddy, basically. And so that's an example for people in really arid climate, but I think it helps demonstrate the point of the raised beds really well too, especially on this issue of rainfall. The higher the beds are, the more moisture you're getting away. The lower the beds are, especially if they're below the soil surface, the more moisture you're going to collect. It would also make sense too for temperature, because the cold air is going to go to lower areas, so it'll keep your vegetables colder as well. All right, so that's the waffle garden. And so the next thing we're going to talk about is soil. So, and like I said, all these factors kind of play into each other, but soil is an important one because it has to do a lot with infiltration and runoff. So infiltration is the rate at which the water actually goes down into the soil profile versus low infiltration soil. You're just going to have high runoff, which is where the water moves across the soil surface and out and down and away. So to demonstrate that, we're going to use some peanut butter. Like, this is the soil I was raised on in coastal Texas. It just was like black peanut butter, mucky and gooey. So the soil texture is going to determine a lot too. Like I said, we're trying to collect moisture when we need it and get rid of it when we don't need it. And so in both these examples, when that rainfall hits that mucky peanut butter, one, it doesn't soak in like it does when the peanut butter's not there, when the soils are sandy versus clay. And then two, the excess runs off a lot more quickly. And so you can use the beds in a controlled way, or the lack of beds in a controlled way, to make use of that moisture. So in the clay soil, one, that water is kind of sitting there on top of the surface. It's still just pooled on top of the peanut butter. But you need to get in there to plant seeds. So the raised bed is going to help in that instance, that it's getting that extra, because it's a clay soil, you need it to dry out somewhat. You need that excess water off your bed and down and away. Clay soils hold moisture really well. Sandy soils give up moisture really well. So in the clay soil, raised beds would make a lot of sense, I think, especially once you start amending it with organic matter. You'll have better infiltration and infiltration rates. And with a sandy soil, an in-ground bed, you're wanting to collect that water as much as possible. In a really sandy soil, like that, maybe the Carolinas or parts of Florida, that water, as soon as it hits the soil, is down and away from your plants, and you may be irrigating a whole lot. It's hard for that soil to hold on. So doing a raised bed in that instance of a very sandy soil, which I guess would be this example, you're going to lose a ton of moisture that way. So if you're trying to get rid of excess water with clay soils, raised beds might be the way to go. If you're trying to hold moisture with sandy soils, in-ground beds are probably the way to go. The next example, or the next factor to consider, is slope. So the garden that I manage is on a slope. We get, I'm not even sure what grade it is, but it's pretty steep slope. And so while we don't do terracing, I do use beds and in-ground beds both, depending on what we're growing in that system. An important consideration with slope is that, especially in the example of like the clay soil, the higher that slope is, the faster that rainfall is going to run away and not infiltrate, especially for an in-ground bed. But for raised beds, you can actually leverage the slope to your advantage. So by putting your beds partially, perpendicular to or parallel to the slope with the contours of the land, you can use those raised beds to actually capture that water and slow it down, move it down the hill. If you do it completely perpendicular to the slope, you can catch a lot of water, and then you'll actually start getting the water to cut across the beds. So you're basically creating little dams. So what I like to do is actually do it at an angle, maybe a 5-degree angle, to where the beds are stopping enough water, but then still able to get it down in a way from with a slope in a controlled way. So that's the examples that I have of winter, rainfall, soil, and slope. I hope that was informative to you and help to clear up when and when not to use raised beds. We'll go back out to the garden and talk a little bit more about that kind of in practice, and I'll show in my garden where I have in-ground beds and where I have raised beds and what I'm doing in each instance. So the pancakes and waffles applied, we're going to look at what it looks like in the garden. This is our Mindful Farmer hoop house, version 1. It's been improved since then. We got pansies, statice, straw flower, and breadseed poppies. These are all cut flowers for a local florist. These did have raised beds because I was trying to get some extra heat and getting rid of some extra moisture through the winter time. So we had lettuce greens and some tulips, and so that helps those beds warm up. So that's the temperature thing we were talking about. Over here, these are our summer cut flowers. And so these beds just got built. They look kind of mounded right now, but it's really just from using the broad fork, kind of fluffs up the beds. And then as time progresses, they'll kind of more so flatten out. You can't really see, but it's probably about 4 inches difference. It also helps, since this is outside, the kids will be running through here. They can see where the beds are, where the flowers are, and where the walk paths are, and know what to stick to. So I just use this conduit to mark out the beds. I'm also going to attach some floral netting to keep the flowers from falling over to these pieces. This is where the chickens were. They got all of our composts for the past 6 months. They've made some really great soil. I'm going to do a whole video later on about how I actually made these beds and how the chickens helped really build the fertility of this soil. We didn't bring in a lot of any outside composts, and very minimal soil amendments. Chickens doing their thing. So here's an example that's a little bit different probably from what I talked about in the video. I mentioned garlic, I mentioned raised beds, but this is garlic on rows in ground. And the reason why I did that, as I'll get on the other side so you can see, is that I basically treated this whole block like one giant raised bed. There's probably a 2-foot dip down at the bottom of my yard. So there's more than enough drainage to where this garlic is going to be higher and drier in the spring. The soil is going to warm up faster than at the bottom of the yard. So it's almost like this is just a giant 14-foot wide raised bed. So that's why it's in ground. If you have enough drainage, if you're not concerned about excess moisture issues, if your soil is not real clay, then the in-ground could be a great option for things that you grow in rows. And one of the reasons why I like to do that for things like the garlic, onions, potatoes, carrots, beets, cabbages is because I can mechanically cultivate. Or I can really quickly cultivate with a wheel hoe. So instead of hand weeding this, imagine all these were carrot tops. I can just run a wheel hoe down each row back and forth, and then I've done my weed management. Another reason why I like the in-ground beds for things like especially root crops or brassicas, is that it's going to hold more moisture in the summertime, which is whenever our spring crops are sizing up, like when the carrots are actually putting on, uh, mass and getting bigger, or it's when I'm seeding the fall round of root crops, kind of August, September, or even July. I want as much of that moisture in the soil as I can. So, you could even think about doing raised beds in the winter and in-ground beds in the summer. And that's kind of my strategy here, where the tunnels and the outside beds for the flowers were raised beds to get warm, and then the things that were planted over the winter were in-ground, but they're going to size up over the summertime when I want them to be moist and cool. So that was my strategy there. I do want to just finish off the video by giving my most important piece of advice, which is to get a soil test. So regardless of if you're doing in-ground bed or raised bed and you're bringing in a lot of compost, or you're doing the no-dig system where you might put down cardboard or paper over your grass and then add compost on top of that, you really need to engage the soil beneath your feet. Feed the life there. Get the nutrients and the minerals in balance in the soil before you add the compost and the mulch. Those are really just, like, I see compost more as a mulch than an amendment. Compost tends to be low in nitrogen and high in salts, so it's not a panacea. It's not a fix-all for every situation. It is good stuff, right? We want organic matter in our soil. But just blindly adding compost and thinking that it has everything your plants need in it is not a good strategy. So soil tests are almost free, pretty much free everywhere, through your local extension office. If you want, you could pay a little bit extra to get organic matter and nitrates tested, which is what I do. I get 2 soil tests a year at the farm that I manage. And it's really helpful for just seeing how you're progressing in your soil management and seeing, we can see that our no-till practices have drastically increased our plant available nitrogen, where we can finish a crop and not have to add any amendments. And the soil is still just really well in balance. And that's exciting. So I hope you'll do the same thing for your garden, even if it's a small place. Even if it's your first year, you can track your progress and see where you've grown. I also pay I think it's $10 more to get organic matter, and then I can see how much carbon I'm sequestering and locking into the soil as my garden progresses, and that's really cool to be able to track. So in our garden space, we did the broad fork. We did kind of a no-dig, no-till. I did broad fork some of our areas because there was a playground at this house when we first moved here. And so I imagine there's a lot of compaction around that playground. So I did broad fork that area. But I didn't lay down paper or cardboard. Instead, I used my chickens. So in the area where the chickens weren't, in the winter time, I put about 18 inches of leaves and kept mowing that down as a mulch to kill off the grass. In the where the chickens were, that's where all of our compost went, and they just stirred that in and composted all that and ate all the weeds that came up and made some really great soil. But that took 6 to 9 months to get ready for our garden. So buying the soil, buying the lumber, a lot of times that's people last minute saying, I need to have a garden. But if you're thinking about doing a garden maybe next year, then this summer, or even right now, is the time to start preparing for it. Getting the grass killed off, getting the soil amended, getting mulches down, feeding the soil. And then that way when you put your plants in next spring, it's just plug and play. And so I hope you're getting your soil tested, you're feeding your soil, you're engaging your soil. And please like and subscribe to my videos, and there's more coming at you soon.